quite there yet, but there's some promise of that. Now, I mentioned that education was one of the most impaired domains in childhood in children with ADHD. It's therefore no surprise that by adulthood, all studies have documented a variety of adverse outcomes in the educational histories of people with ADHD. And here are many of them. Now, when you look at the percentages in parentheses, if you see the abbreviation MKE, those are the results of my study at that age 27 follow-up. If you see a range of numbers, like 20 to 40% were retained in grade, that's the range that's been found in all of the other follow-up studies of ADHD children to adulthood. Now notice that many ADHD children, especially in my study, have been retained in grade at least once because of their academic problems. That is to say, they had to repeat a grade. Below that, notice that I've mentioned a study, of which there are several, that show that this is harmful to children, that the very act of retaining them in a grade will lead to new adverse outcomes that would not have been there had they not been retained. And there are ways of statistically demonstrating that in analyzing the results of follow-up studies. But suffice to say here that we should not be recommending grade retention as a solution for ADHD because it creates its own problems. It can lead to loss of interest in learning, loss of motivation to attend school, more aggression in males, more depression in females, greater peer relationships than they already had before they were retained. That is, greater problems with peers. And finally, a much greater likelihood of simply dropping out of school before completing compulsory education than would have been the case had they not been retained. So those are many of the harms we do when we retain children in school, particularly ADHD children, and therefore we don't recommend that as a solution. Now, in the U.S., ADHD children were eligible for special educational services, but mostly after 1991 when we changed our educational laws. Prior to that time, they only got special services if they had some other disorder, like a learning disability or a language disorder, that was warranted and authorized to receive special education. We've noticed since 1991, in more recent follow-up studies, that the amount of special education children receive is now toward the higher end of services, and that's good news. More like 50% are getting help in school than was the case in my study. Even so, studies continue to show that because of behavior problems and disciplinary problems, many children with ADHD, 60% in my study, had been suspended at least once from school because of their behavior or conduct. Certainly this was predicted by how many children had developed conduct disorder by adolescence, but ADHD alone was also a risk factor for suspension. And notice for expulsion, which is being kicked out of school entirely rather than just suspended for a few days or a week. And here you see that 14% of children in my study and 10 to 18% in the other studies were expelled from school and not allowed to return. Now, in the Milwaukee study, we had a very high dropout rate of children not completing high school, about 32%. And you can see that the other studies are very similar to that. But I would like to point out some hopeful news. There have been additional follow-up studies that were started in the 1990s and that are completing their follow-ups now of those children as they reach adulthood. Now keep in mind that many of the children in these new studies did receive special education, weren't likely to be retained or expelled. And what do we find? The dropout rate is very similar to typical children now. In other words, there's a marked reduction in the likelihood of quitting school by providing special educational services to these at-risk children. So that's good news. It means that assistance in school can help with these educational outcomes. But by adulthood, even among the children who completed school, we found that they had lower grade point averages, lower achievement test scores, lower class ranking as a result of their lower grades, and that many were unlikely to enter college. Notice the difference. Over 77% of the children in our control group went on to college, and about 35 to 45% of them completed college. That figure was only 22% of the ADHD children attempted college, and look down below, about 5 to 10% completed it. So this explains why ADHD children have much less educational attainment than do other children upon reaching adulthood. College is difficult for them. They're unlikely to see it through. Hopefully, with the new requirements that colleges must provide accommodations for people with ADHD in the U.S., perhaps we will see improvement in these graduation rates. Now, what should we do about these educational risks? One thing, of course, is to educate teachers and schools about ADHD and its associated academic risks, and encourage them to provide services to these children as soon as these problems occur. A second is to make sure that we've trained teachers in the appropriate strategies, behavior management methods, and other curriculum adjustments that they can use to help ADHD children succeed in school. Perhaps implementing an ADHD representative or liaison at school who has more expertise in ADHD and who can consult to other teachers in advising them on how to manage an ADHD child in their classroom. Maybe that would be helpful. Schools that adopted that kind of liaison model or school consultation model have children with ADHD who do better in school than schools that didn't adopt that system. And by the way, that school liaison can also be meeting with parents when parents call and have concerns, and then can represent those parents' interests by speaking with the child's teachers, where the parent then begins to feel like they've been listened to and their concerns were heard and that action is being taken to help their child. So the liaison can work both ways, helping parents negotiate the system and get information about their children, and consulting with teachers on how to help in the classroom. We have also shown that early screening and identification can also be helpful. At kindergarten, for instance, using simply a rating scale of ADHD symptoms and beginning to pull out children who are being rated very high on those rating scales by their parents, referring those children for a more thorough psychological or psychiatric evaluation, led us to find upwards of 70% or more of children who screened positive for ADHD wound up actually having ADHD in that evaluation. And those who didn't were found to have other developmental disorders, such as learning disorders, high-functioning autism, oppositional and conduct problems, and so forth. Some studies indicate that you don't need formal special educational services, as we have in the U.S., such as separate classrooms, with teachers who have had additional training. Instead, what are called pre-referral forms of assistance, having a consultant meet with the regular education teachers and give them a few simple strategies to try in the classroom, could wind up with fewer children needing to go on to these more expensive special classes for children with learning and developmental disabilities. So we refer to this as pre-referral assistance or consultation. If necessary, of course, the children can go on and get the more systematic and formal types of educational assistance that special educational services provide, but it isn't necessary for all children. Research also shows that if you institute medication for ADHD earlier and you use one of the more modern extended release forms of the medication, this too greatly reduces the educational impairments in children with ADHD and can lead many more of them to complete their education than might otherwise have been the case. We'd like to recommend that schools obtain vocational assessments on ADHD children, and to some extent in high school, provide some technical training in some occupational skills before the children leave school, so that if they choose not to go to college, and many of them won't go, they leave high school with some employable entry-level skills to get a job in the workforce. The next domain that we're going to examine, of course, after leaving school is employment. What happens in the workplace when we study children grown up with ADHD or adults with ADHD? We identify many different kinds of problems. Now again, not all adults with ADHD have these problems, but notice that they are at higher risk of doing so than are others who don't have ADHD. So notice, about 55% of ADHD children had been dismissed or fired from a job, compared to only about 23% of control children by age 21. And by the time they got to age 27, another 43% of the ADHD children had been dismissed from employment, versus just 14% of the control group by that age during that interim period. So, people with ADHD are more likely to lose their jobs. They're also more likely to change jobs out of boredom, as you see here, and to skip from one job to another, with ADHD children doing so more than twice as often as the typical control group children did. When we ask employers to rate these employees on levels of ADHD and oppositional symptoms, as well as on their workplace performance, the employers rated them as having many more symptoms than we saw from the employers of our typical children. And as you see on the next slide, their ratings of workplace performance were worse. Other studies, such as the one in New York, indicate that by the time children with ADHD are at least 30 years of age or older, a lot more of them have moved into self-employment than we see in the typical population. Perhaps this is because they have trouble holding a job when they work for other people, and therefore, of necessity, they have to go to work for themselves. Or it may just be that self-employment is a particular niche in which ADHD individuals are more successful and therefore are more likely to thrive and to opt into self-employment as a result. So it's hard to tell why that figure is higher than that of typical people. But it does suggest that self-employment and maybe even entrepreneurial activities might be more suitable to people with ADHD than it is to others. Even so, all studies that have followed children to adulthood show that they earn less money, are more likely to be receiving some type of social or unemployment assistance. They're 12 times more likely, at least in Sweden, to be out on work disability as a result of their ADHD, which is markedly higher than is seen below for conduct disorder, CD, or for learning disorders, LD, and very similar to what is seen for autism spectrum disorder, which is kind of interesting. Makes it look as if ADHD by adulthood might be as impairing in the workplace as is autism spectrum. Now, we also found that these individuals had more health problems, less education, took more time off from work, in other words, had less time in their role as an employee, and as I said earlier, were more likely to leave their employment. Some of this is related to their disadvantaged backgrounds, but most of it was related to their ADHD. So what to do about this? Well, we're not sure because there are no real studies of this other than a few recent ones looking at the impact of medication on those statistics. So what could we do? As with school, make sure that employers are educated about ADHD and the kinds of adjustments and accommodations that could be made for the ADHD adult to be more successful there. We have to be careful of that, however, because some employers will not be very sympathetic to an employee having ADHD and might take steps to document their failures, perhaps more rigorously, and therefore get them fired. But working with some employers might be a good thing to do where those employers are open and compassionate to helping adults with ADHD. I've mentioned what I think is the value of vocational assessment and technical training in high school might help improve these figures as ADHD children leave school with employable skills. We don't know, no one has tried that, but it makes common sense. Counseling the adult with ADHD about what kinds of employment might match their disorder, that is, an ADHD-friendly workplace. And my books on adult ADHD talk about the kinds of employment that seem to be more suitable to people with ADHD and in which they report being less impaired. For instance, moving into athletics or becoming a physical education teacher or joining the military, becoming an emergency medical technician or a policeman or a fireman. All of these are very active occupations in which there's a great deal of movement and in which the individual, particularly in the military, is receiving additional care, structure, discipline beyond what others would get outside the military. And maybe that's helpful too. Extra structure can be helpful to them and extra feedback as is done in the military. And there could be disciplines such as performing arts, musician, comedian, actor or actress. What about self-employment in the trades, carpenter, plumber, landscaper, and so on? Or how about overall construction and construction work? And then, of course, what about the culinary arts and cooking? These are all areas I suggest because they're areas in which we find ADHD adults more likely to be employed and to report that they are more effective in those kinds of employment than are others. So it seems that movement, activity, structure, feedback, change, all of these may play some role in what kinds of jobs are good for people who have ADHD, such as door-to-door sales, for instance, that involves movement, change of scenery, meeting with many other people, conversing with them, and, of course, selling them things. And maybe ADHD people seem better at that, because we certainly find that more people in sales occupations are likely to have ADHD. And then lastly, as I mentioned in school, making reasonable accommodations for their disorder, but also using extended release medications might be beneficial in the workplace just as much as they were in school. And indeed, recent large-scale studies and even meta-analyses of many studies show that when adults with ADHD are on medication, many of these risks are reduced when compared to the months where they are off their medication. And by the way, that includes risk for accidents, injuries, suicide, and early mortality, not just improvement in their workplace or education or driving or peer relationships, all of which have also been found to be improved by medication. Now, of course, when you work, you earn money. So how do people with ADHD handle money? Well, not well. As you can see here from my Milwaukee study, look at the black bar, the one on the left for each category of financial problems. Those are the ADHD children who ADHD persisted into adulthood. The white bar is the group whose ADHD didn't persist, but many of them we're still symptomatic. And the other bar on the right, the third bar with the more dense polka dots in it, that's our control group, our community group. And so you can see when we look across these various problems with money, people growing up with ADHD, even if they no longer had the diagnosis, still have problems with overall financial management, with impulsive buying, with missing routine payments on their credit cards, cars, rent, utilities, and other debts. Maybe even having missed making a payment on their card and having exceeded their credit limit. Notice on the far right that overall, by age 27, the higher percentage of adults with ADHD had very poor credit ratings with credit agencies than did more typical individuals. Makes perfect sense when you understand all of these more specific financial problems. Here you're going to see some additional difficulties with financial outcomes as a result of growing up with ADHD. Notice that adults with ADHD earn about 37% less than comparison individuals. 23% of them might be in need of financial assistance, particularly from family members, as young adults. They had lower starting salaries and progressed up the income level in their employment much more slowly than did other people. You can see here that 66% of them had saved little, if any, money, and twice as many had absolutely no money saved up at all in comparison to the young adults who are typical people and don't have ADHD. And again, we've already discussed many of these other specific financial problems. Notice on the last line, however, if we total up across the working life of someone with ADHD and someone who doesn't have ADHD, there's nearly a $1.3 million difference in income during their careers in those with ADHD compared to those in the control group. That is a substantial difference in income when it is accumulated over one's working life. Another area in which people with ADHD have major difficulties is in operation of a motor vehicle and driving on our highways among other drivers. Look at all the problems researchers, including myself, have found in our detailed studies of this domain of ADHD outcomes. More problems handling the vehicle, slower reaction time, much less use of safe driving habits as witnessed by others, much more likely to drive before they're allowed to drive, so driving illegally as young teens, greater risk taking, more illegal actions, more crashes, citations, and certainly a worse number of crashes. That is to say, the crashes they have are markedly worse in terms of dollar damages done and number of people harmed in the accident. So their accidents are worse. All of this leading to nearly 3 times the likelihood that your license would be suspended during the first 10 years of driving than we would have seen in other people. And you can see the percentage suspended here. My studies also show that alcohol, even in low doses, has a very detrimental impact on the driving of these individuals. And that, of course, is sensible. When you look that they're impaired in their driving already, driving as if they're already intoxicated when they're not, even adding a little bit of intoxication into that mix can be very detrimental on their driving performance and their increased likelihood of crashes and possibly even injury and death. Studies out of Brazil and elsewhere show that people with ADHD are more likely to engage in motorcycle sports, other motor sports, and extreme sports, and are more likely to suffer injuries from that participation than we see in typical adults. All right then, what to do? How to help? First, we need to educate families of teenagers about these risks? I find that many people don't. That's a shame. Parents should not feel as if they need to allow their teenager to drive at the same time that other teens are driving if their teen has a diagnosis of ADHD. We need to make sure that primary care physicians are also well informed about these risks and sit down and counsel families about going slow with the learner's permit, maybe adopting a more graduated licensing approach, perhaps also using medication while driving, which I mention on the next slide. Graduated licensing refers to taking a longer period to achieve independent driving than is the case with other individuals. Perhaps spending 3 to 6 months under close supervision with daytime driving. And if they handle that, moving up to nighttime driving for another 3 months with adults in the car. And if they handle that, allowing them to drive alone. And only after 3 months of that without problem, allowing them to have other peers in the car with them and be fully independent drivers. Even then, research has shown that the availability of smart technology, such as cell phones, in the car increases distractibility and risk of these driving problems by more than 50%. And while it does that for typical teens also, ADHD teens are already at risk because of their ADHD, and multiplying that by 50% just further magnifies these adverse outcomes. Telling ADHD teens not to use their cell phone is no good. That won't work. They're more likely to do so. But finding other ways to do so, such as through applications that are downloaded onto a cell phone, or through purchasing of a Bluetooth transmitter or other device that blocks cell phone signals in the car when the car is turned on, are ways of simply preventing the use of smartphones and therefore eliminating that source of distraction. My friend Dan Cox, working at the University of Virginia, has shown that even something as simple as allowing them to drive cars with manual transmissions reduces some of their risks while driving because they're moving more, participating more in the shifting and the braking and use of the clutch than you would do with a manual transmission. And that involvement in driving may enhance their attention to their driving. Obviously, parents need to supervise the use of vehicles with teenagers who are driving, understanding where they're going, when they're coming back, and even checking up on them unexpectedly to see if they are where they said they were. Using apps like Find My Smartphone or other GPS tracking apps that can be installed on the teen's phone can also allow parents and others to monitor the teen's use of the vehicle and where they're going. You can even, for a few $100s, install a camera called the Drive Cam that goes on the rear view mirror and that records not only what is taking place on the roadway in front of the driver, but also has a second camera that is recording the driver's behavior as well. And parents can look at these videos when the teen gets home to see just how well or poorly the teen was driving. So there's lots of technology and devices we might use to reduce some of these risks. But of all of them, the one that to date has shown the most benefit is taking medication while driving and avoiding alcohol, of course. ADHD medications, particularly the stimulants, have been found to substantially reduce the risks of collisions and traffic problems and speeding tickets among teens and adults